It was the morning of June 30th, 1908. Deep in the remote wilderness of Siberia, near the Podkamennaya Tunguska River, the world was quiet. The forests stretched endlessly in every direction, millions of dark green trees covering the land like an ocean of leaves. In small, scattered settlements, hunters, traders, and members of the Evenki people were beginning their morning routines. Breakfast fires were burning. The sky was clear. Nothing about that morning suggested that it would become one of the greatest scientific mysteries in modern history. Then, without warning, the sky changed. Witnesses would later say that a strange blue-white column of light appeared high above the horizon. It was almost as bright as the sun, yet it was moving, cutting across the sky like a blazing torch. Some described it as a glowing cylinder. Others said it looked like a giant ball of fire dragging a tail behind it. The object streaked through the atmosphere, leaving a trail of brilliance that forced people to shield their eyes. For several minutes, it moved silently over the Siberian wilderness. Then, the sky split open. A flash of light exploded across the horizon so bright that people hundreds of kilometers away believed the sun had suddenly appeared in the wrong part of the sky. Moments later, a deafening roar rolled across the land. It sounded like artillery fire, like thunder, like the sky itself was tearing apart. And then the ground began to shake. A massive shockwave blasted through the forests. Trees bent and snapped like matchsticks. Windows shattered in distant villages. People were thrown off their feet. In some places, the blast knocked down entire buildings. The explosion was so powerful that seismic stations across Eurasia recorded it as if it were an earthquake. But the strangest part of the event was where it happened. The explosion occurred over one of the most remote places on Earth. There were no cities, no cameras, no scientists nearby to observe it. Only witnesses who could barely understand what they had seen. One of those witnesses was a man named S. Semenov. That morning, he was sitting outside a trading post about 65 kilometers from the center of the explosion. He was having breakfast when he noticed something strange in the northern sky. Suddenly, he said, the sky appeared to split in two. A wall of fire appeared above the forest, spreading across the horizon. The heat became intense, almost unbearable, as if his clothes were about to ignite. Then came a violent shock wave that threw him several meters across the ground. For a moment, he lost consciousness. When he woke, the air was filled with the sound of crashing trees and distant explosions. The earth trembled beneath him as if a massive artillery barrage was shaking the land. Another witness, a member of the Evenki people named Chuchan, described an equally terrifying scene. He and his brother were sleeping inside a small hut near the river when something suddenly woke them. They felt as if an invisible force had shoved them. Outside, they heard a strange whistling sound rushing through the air. Then, a powerful gust of wind slammed into their hut, knocking it over completely. When Chuchan looked outside, he saw something he would never forget. The forest itself seemed to be collapsing. Trees were falling in every direction. Branches were burning. The sky was filled with blinding flashes of light, so bright that he had to shut his eyes. It was, he said, like seeing a second sun in the sky. The thunder continued again and again, echoing across the wilderness. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the event was over. But the destruction it left behind was enormous. When scientists later studied the region, they discovered that the blast had flattened approximately 80 million trees across an area of more than 2,000 square kilometers. The trees were not burned to ashes or blasted outward randomly. Instead, they had fallen in a strange radial pattern, as if a massive force had exploded above the forest and pushed everything outward from a single point in the sky. It was an area larger than many major cities. If the explosion had occurred over a populated region, the destruction would have been catastrophic. Modern estimates suggest that the energy released that morning was somewhere between 5 and 30 megatons of TNT. The most likely estimate is around 10 to 15 megatons. To understand what that means, consider this. The atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima during World War II had a yield of about 15 kilotons. The Tunguska explosion was roughly 1,000 times more powerful. And yet, despite the scale of the destruction, there was something incredibly strange about the site of the explosion. There was no crater. In most impact events, when an asteroid strikes the Earth, it leaves behind a massive hole in the ground. But when researchers eventually reached the Tunguska region years later, they found no such crater, just miles and miles of flattened forest. This mystery puzzled scientists for decades. What could possibly release that much energy without leaving a crater? Even stranger, in the nights following the explosion, people across Europe and Asia reported unusually bright skies. Observers in cities thousands of kilometers away described glowing clouds that lit up the night so brightly that newspapers could be read outdoors after midnight. Something enormous had happened in Siberia, but it took more than a decade before scientists could investigate. In 1921, a Leonid Kulik, a Russian mineralogist, began the first scientific expedition into the Tunguska region. Traveling through swamps, dense forests, and frozen terrain, Kulik was determined to solve the mystery. When he finally reached the devastated forest, he was stunned by what he saw. The trees were lying flat in every direction, all pointing away from a central point where the explosion had occurred high in the atmosphere. Yet near the very center of the blast zone, many trees were still standing upright, stripped of their branches like giant telephone poles. This strange pattern suggested something unexpected. The explosion had not happened on the ground. It had happened in the air. Kulik believed that a giant meteorite had struck the region, but he could not find the impact crater he expected. Instead, he discovered strange circular depressions in the swampy terrain that he thought might be meteorite craters. But when his team drained one of these depressions, they found something surprising at the bottom: an old tree stump. The depression had existed long before the explosion. For years, the Tunguska mystery deepened. Later expeditions in the 1950s and 1960s uncovered microscopic clues hidden in the soil and inside tree resin. Tiny spherical particles made of silicate and magnetite were discovered scattered across the region. These particles contained unusually high amounts of nickel compared to iron, exactly the kind of chemical signature scientists expect from extraterrestrial material. In other words, fragments of something from space had fallen into the forest. But still, no large meteorite was ever found. Today, most scientists believe the Tunguska event was caused by an airburst. A relatively small asteroid or comet fragment, perhaps only a few dozen meters wide, entered Earth's atmosphere traveling at incredible speed, likely more than 11 kilometers per second. As it plunged through the atmosphere, the air in front of it compressed violently, generating extreme heat and pressure. Eventually, the object could no longer withstand the stress. At an altitude of roughly 5 to 10 kilometers above the ground, it exploded. The resulting shock wave traveled downward and outward, flattening millions of trees across the Siberian forest. Because the object exploded in the air rather than striking the ground, it left no crater behind. But even today, more than 100 years later, scientists still debate exactly what kind of object caused the explosion. Some researchers believe it was a rocky asteroid. Others argue it may have been a small comet composed largely of ice and dust. If that were the case, the object could have completely vaporized during the explosion, leaving almost no physical fragments behind. There are even more unusual theories. Some scientists have suggested that a fragment of the comet Encke may have been responsible. Others have proposed that a surviving fragment might have struck the ground nearby, possibly forming a small lake called Lake Checo, located several kilometers from the blast center. But not all researchers agree. Recent geological studies suggest that Lake Checo may actually be much older than the 1908 event. And so, the debate continues. What makes the Tunguska event even more fascinating is that it might not be as rare as we once believed.
Small objects from space enter Earth's atmosphere every day. Most of them burn up harmlessly before reaching the ground. But occasionally, larger objects explode in the atmosphere with tremendous force. In fact, something similar happened again in 2013. Over the city of Chelyabinsk, a small asteroid, roughly 20 meters wide, entered the Earth's atmosphere and exploded high above the city. The blast shattered windows across the region and injured more than 1,000 people, mostly from flying glass. And yet, the Chelyabinsk explosion was far smaller than Tunguska. If the Tunguska object had exploded over a major city today, millions of lives could have been at risk. Which raises a chilling question. How many Tunguska-style objects are still out there, silently traveling through space, waiting to cross Earth's path?